All right. Okay, we are all ready to start our webinar. So this is the second seminar of your EF Teacher Development Series. So welcome, everyone. In this webinar, I'm going to be giving you some advice and examples of how you can exploit the board as a resource in your lessons. I'm going to make this webinar interactive, and I'm going to ask you some questions during the webinar. When I ask you a question, please write your answers and comments in the chat box that you are using now. I will save 10 minutes at the end of the session for you to ask any extra questions that you have. There will also be a final question at the end of the webinar that you will need to answer in order to complete your certificate at the end of the course. So please make sure you listen right the way through the webinar and complete that final question at the end. So before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Bryony and I'm from England, but I currently live and teach English in Spain. I've worked with a variety of nationalities, ages, and levels during my time teaching English. And my first experience teaching was actually in Indonesia when I was traveling. I worked in different schools teaching young learners and teenagers. Since that experience, I've been living in Spain. I started working with EF in 2016. Where I taught in Madrid, teaching adults and also overseeing the academic team. I ran teacher training sessions and completed lots of observations. This summer, I worked with EF in Hastings, a small town in England, as academic manager. At this place, we taught teenagers from all over the world in a multinational setting. I completed my Delta qualification this year, where I improved my skills and spent a lot of time thinking about various aspects of the classroom and how I could exploit materials better. So welcome everyone to this webinar. We are going to talk about how you can improve your board work. Often, this isn't something teachers think about a lot. Instead, we focus on our lesson plans and the content of our classes. In this webinar, we're going to look at how we can improve this skill to help our students. So first, can you please write an adjective in the chat box describing your board work? For example, is it very organized or is it a little bit messy? I'll give you 1 minute to write some adjectives. A little bit messy, yes, very honest. Good, some organized, interesting. A bit of a mess, nice. All right, good. So hopefully I can help some of you people who are saying it's a little messy or not very clear. And for those who are more confident, maybe I can give you some extra tips and advice to help you. So I consider the board to be a very important resource in the classroom, especially in low resource classrooms, because the board is like a canvas on which you can provide visual support for your class. So now I want to do some brainstorming. What can I put on the board? What are some different things that I can use my board for in a lesson? Again, write your answers in the chat box. Good. Vocabulary, objectives, some notes, things you want to focus on, pictures, good idea, structures. Good. Your key points as well, sentence patterns. These are lots of things. As you can see, you have lots of different answers, and there are no limits about how we can use our board. So the first thing I want to talk about is planning ahead. How important this is in order to have an organized and clear board. So, one of the most useful pieces of advice I ever received was to separate my board into different sections, each with a different purpose. If you keep adding things to your board with no obvious system, it can look messy and it can confuse your students. So here you can see in the image that I have got 3 different sections. Can you write in the chat box, what are these sections for? What is number 1 for? What is number 2 and number 3 for? Good, we've got some ideas coming. People are saying number 1 for objectives, good. Number 3 for vocabulary. What other ideas? Got people writing about number 2. Someone said a lead-in, good. This is a discussion question on the board in number 2. But what can I put in number 2? What is this section for? Someone said for brainstorming, good. A debate, good. Nice. Someone said number 2 is for grammar, very good. All right, so I have separated the sections into number 1 is where I'm putting my aims. As you can see, it even says aims at the top because it's very important that your students know what they are practicing and learning in your lesson. Another word for aims is objectives. I think some of you have written. Number 2, this space, I have a question in the middle of it, but it can be used for a lot more than just questions. As you've mentioned, grammar, maybe you can put corrections in this area. You can stick photos to the board in this space. This space is the one you can play with the most. And then the third section is a list for new vocabulary. In fact, I would recommend drawing a line, as you can see in the picture, down the side so that you separate this area and remember to add new and useful vocabulary during the lesson. Creating a system like this, how you lay out your board into different sections, and using it consistently is important as it helps students to find relevant information during the lesson. They will know where to find new vocabulary. They will know where to look if you say, everyone answer the discussion question on the board. They will know to look in the second section in the middle. An organized board shows your students that you are an organized teacher who plans their classes in detail. This will also help your students be more organized in their notebooks. So it's very important that you as the teacher show the students how they can organize their own workbooks. And that can be done by having an organized system on the board. Another way we can plan ahead is by planning what to write before the lessons. And by this, I mean plan what you want your board to look like at each stage of the class. Take a piece of paper and write or draw what you will put on the board at each stage. What do you want the board to look like during your lead-in? What do you want to look like during a language focus or grammar stage? This way you are prepared and don't have to make quick decisions during the lessons about where to write on your board. Make sure you include this piece of paper in your lesson plan so that you can refer to it during your lessons. This is a great way to know how much space you need for each time you write on the board. I'm sure that most teachers have had the experience of trying to write more onto the bottom of the board because they've realized that they've run out of space to add more. Perhaps the teacher will write on a different part of the board and draw an arrow to connect the pieces of writing. However, this can look messy. I've also seen teachers start to write in very small writing in order to fit everything onto the board. So if you plan before and know how much you want to put on the board, this can really help stop that from happening. Make an effort this week in your classes to add a board plan to your lesson plans and to reflect on these after the class. Did they help you or not help you during your lesson to keep your board nice and organized? Another way to plan ahead is to think about when to write on the board. If you need to write a lot on the board, when should you write it? Can you write your answers in the chat box, please? Good, some examples so far. All right, so these are ideas of why you want to write things. But imagine I want to write a text or I want to write 6 questions on the board. When should I write those questions? So I want to write 6 questions on the board. When should I write those questions? Before the lesson. One idea, good. Any other ideas about when to write? So I would recommend avoid long teacher writing times when the students are watching you in the class. This slows your lesson down and it can be boring for your students to watch you writing the questions, and it wastes valuable class time. So make use of the time when your students are reading or maybe speaking in groups to write your questions on the board. This is time when the students are doing something different, and maybe it's not the best time to be monitoring them when you can write on the board. This is when you want to write a lot of things. If you are brainstorming and eliciting from the students, definitely be writing at the same time, putting their ideas on the board. But when you want to write a lot, good, as some of you are saying, avoid dead time or time when only the teacher is writing. Do this when the students are reading, perhaps, or speaking in groups, and you don't need to monitor them. Good. So these are 3 ways we can plan ahead. The next thing I want to talk about is what you should keep on the board and what you should wipe off the board. What are some typical problems of not wiping information off the board? Imagine if everything you wrote on the board stayed on the board. How would your board look? Messy and distracting. Good ideas. Confused. Messy again. Good. A lot of the same ideas coming. Students don't understand because there isn't important things on the board anymore. Good. So if you don't wipe things off the board, it could distract students. It could make it difficult to locate important information, and it looks unorganized, exactly as you have said. It looks messy and it can confuse the students. So, if you look at this image of a board, what information can now be wiped off this board? What would you wipe off? Would you wipe off the aims, the discussion question, these sentences here, or the new vocabulary? What would you wipe off? Some people are saying to wipe off the aims. I would actually recommend keeping the aims on the board during the lesson so that students know what they are learning. Well, the examples were the last thing to be written on the board. Good, it's the passive tense. The discussion question, excellent. I would wipe off the discussion question on the board because the students don't need it anymore. They have answered this question and now we're moving on to a language stage. So it would be much better to remove this question so that students can focus on what is now important, which is these example sentences. As someone has said, the changing sentences from active to the passive. It indicates to your students that we are changing activity and that there is a change of focus. So students know that they are moving on. But it is important I'm going to say this again, to keep the aims on the board so that students know during the lesson what they are studying. And also to keep the new language, this vocabulary that's come up, to keep that on the board as well, so that students can keep practicing and using it. Remember that you can include this type of information if you make a board plan to use in class. In your board plan, you can show that you're going to take off the discussion question before the next stage of the class. However, so these are some different ideas. Doesn't distract students. Only necessary information is displayed. It keeps your board tidy and it signifies a change of activity. But one thing to remember is don't wipe things off too soon. If you have a lot of text on the board and your students are copying that text, make sure that your students are ready before you wipe off that information. It's a good idea to ask your students, are you ready for me to wipe things off the board? Or do you need an extra minute? So don't wipe things off too early. Good, I can see. All right, next stage. So when we list new words and we are eliciting useful language that students can use, it's important not just to list all the new words. If you do this, your list will be hundreds of words long. So in your new vocabulary column, keep the language that you include relevant and useful for your students. Prioritize what language will be most useful for your students. This list that you can see is actually too long. It's much better to use fewer words that students will remember and be able to practice during the lesson. If you look at the top section of this list of new words, what information is included in this list of vocabulary, these 5 words? Please write in the chat box what extra information is included in that list. The date, yes, the date's at the top, but in the vocabulary. I'll let you write some ideas. Good, we've got people saying stress, grammatical categories, or word class, we can say. Parts of speech, good. Whether it's a verb or a noun, exactly. Verb, noun, stress. Oh, good, lots of ideas. Thank you very much, guys. So we've got the word class. We can see if the word is a verb or a noun, or at the bottom, an adjective as well. When I did my CELTA class, I was told always include the word class. It helps students know when they can use a word in a sentence. If something is a verb, if something is a noun, and it gives them an idea of how they can use it. But it's very important to tell your students what these mean. There's no point putting N if students don't know that it refers to a noun, or V, a verb, or as you can see here in reliable, that it's an adjective. Explain to your student what these symbols mean so that when they copy them, they know why they are there. Next thing that's important to include is stress. As you know, English has some difficult stress patterns, and it can help your students to know where the stress goes in each word. I like to write small circles above the sounds which are not stressed and a big circle over the stress sound. Other ideas you can do is to underline the part of the word that is stressed. And finally, I've also included pronunciation features. As you can see here, I've added the phoneme that makes the sound ch for manufacture. Or I've made it clear that the way we pronounce this is reliable, so that students know how they can say a word. It's very important that students understand a word and that they know what it means, but also so that they can pronounce it, so that when they are speaking or listening, they know what word they are hearing. So get yourself into the habit of automatically including the word class, including stress, and also including pronunciation features by using phonemes. We don't need to use phonemes for the entire word, but only for the vowels or the syllables that have a confusing pronunciation. This will depend on the nationalities of your students. As I teach mainly Spanish students, I know that they will often pronounce this word reliable as reliable. So I've added this I because I know it will help them pronounce this part of the word better. And I've seen someone's written, it's very visual, and that really helps your students. The board is a visual resource, and so you should use it to do this. Your students can appreciate all the extra details that you provide. Okay, moving on. Yes, don't forget to make sure your students know what this additional information means. Next section, write what you want your students to write. Many students have the opinion that everything you write on the board should be copied into their notebooks. So it's important to remember that when you write things on the board, if you write a lot, your students will also write a lot into their notebooks. So make sure you prioritize what you want them to write. I'm going to ask one more question for you. When would be a good time to decide how much to put on the board? When do you decide how much you are going to write on the board? You can answer in the chat box. I'll just let you have a few answers. When planning the lesson. Good. I see people have written before the lesson, when you're planning the lesson. No, not 5 minutes left to finish the class. So before the lesson, exactly. This is something else to include in your planning stage with your board work. Only put on the board what you need to put on the board before the lesson. Yes, good. Also, when you write on the board, be careful about your spelling. If you spell something wrong on the board, your students will copy it down, assuming that it's correct. However, if you notice after you've written it down that you have spelled something incorrectly or you notice a mistake, don't be afraid to tell your students, I've made a mistake. I need you to correct this word. I have been in this situation before where I have noticed I spelt something wrong, and I'm very happy to say to the students, oops, I've made a mistake. Can everyone change this in their notebooks? So that students only write down the correct information into their notebooks. Good. I see some people agree with me and that they have done this too. Yes, of course. Only include important information. You don't need to write everything down onto your board because it will add to that messy look or it won't look very organized. All right. Something else that is important to remember when using the board is the colors you use and also being consistent. So, as I have said, boards are a visual resource in a lesson and they need to be visually appealing for your students. So, what I recommend is this week when you are in your classes or next week, take a moment to look at your board. How does it look? Can your students easily find information that they need? Can they understand your writing? Again, I speak from experience. My handwriting is often better at the beginning of the class than at the end of the class. So you have to remember to be consistent with handwriting during the lesson. I have also observed some teachers where I've had to look very, very carefully at a word to understand what they have written. So make sure your writing is clear for your students in the classroom. Also, we can use different colors when we're writing on the board, and different colors can be very useful. They can highlight and indicate different types of information. As you saw in the photo of my vocabulary list, different things have been marked in different colors. For example, you can add the stress in one color. You can add pronunciation and phonemes in a different color. Yes, of course, if we're using a whiteboard, we are using pens. And if we're using a blackboard, we can still use different colored chalks to highlight. So having a black, a blue, and a green, and maybe a red pen is more than enough. I've also seen classes where the teacher has got very excited about using lots of different colors. But be careful not to go too crazy because it can take a lot of time and it can also be very distracting. The board needs to be easy for the students to read. It doesn't need to be a rainbow of colors or a painting almost by using lots of different colors. It's important that the students can quickly find useful information, and that's when colors will help you highlight this. I'm going to show you a photo of a new vocabulary column. And I want you to be thinking about consistency and making things easy for the students to find. What's wrong with this vocabulary list? Write some answers in the chat box. What's wrong with this vocabulary list? We've got different colors. What's being in different colors? Too many colors, I can see. Good. Inconsistency. Thank you. Yes. Inconsistency in color for words and stress. As you can see here, some of the words I've written in blue. And then maybe I'm not holding my blue pen anymore and I'm holding my black pen. So I start writing words in black. And then later I change back to blue. How does this look? Write your answer. How do you think this looks? Good. People have said messy. Too many colors. It's confusing. Good. Confusing and messy. Look, too many colors. Exactly. So this is why consistency is very important. I should keep all my words in the same color. So these two words here should be in blue. I've also changed the color that I'm using for phonemes. Again, that can be confusing for students. Writing the phonemes is very useful for pronunciation, but if students think I'm doing something different with these, then they won't understand that the green here symbolizes pronunciation. Same colors for each type. Very good. Discombobulating. Nice adjective. As you can see, also, I haven't included the word class for some of these words. Again, not being consistent, and the student might not know that this, for example, is a verb. And then this word here, I clearly have no longer want it, so I've crossed it out with a red marker. This again adds to that messy look. It's important to keep our boards nice and clean and easy for our students to read. So I'm glad you all agree with me and think that this is too messy to show to our students. So I recommend this point here, choosing a system and applying it consistently. This refers to your colors and also to your layout of your board. Good. I can see people are still writing that too many colors are involved. Exactly. Make it visually appealing, but very obvious what you are highlighting with those colors. So I'm now going to move on to my conclusion and talk about what we have spoken about in this webinar. In this session, we've talked about various ways you can improve your board work and how you can exploit the board as a resource in the classroom. We have spoken about planning ahead, and this involves planning how to organize your board into different sections, each with a different purpose, creating a board plan before the class, and planning what to write on the board before the lesson. We also talked about what to keep on your whiteboard and what to wipe off, remembering that wiping off certain information signifies a new stage of the class and letting students know that you are moving on to the next exercise. Don't list too many new words. You want to give your students an opportunity to commit some of those words to memory. This means we cannot be adding words continuously every time a student uses a new or a useful word. Prioritize what is most useful for your lesson and for your students. Next, we spoke about writing what you want your students to write down, because remember, they will copy you. I have seen many students who want to write every single thing the teacher has written on the board. So be very selective and remember to think about this during your planning stage. Also, be careful about spelling. Finally, we spoke about colour, which you're still talking about now. We should not use too many colours and that we should use them for specific things to highlight different information. And finally, be consistent. If you choose one way of doing things, your students will remember. They will know where to look on the board for new vocabulary, where they need to look for discussion questions. And they will learn what are your specific teaching patterns. So I hope that this has helped you. I recommend spending some time focusing on your board work. Something which helps me and something which I recommend is take a photo of your board at the end of a lesson or maybe during a lesson if you have an opportunity so that you can reflect on, do you think your board is easy to understand or is it difficult to understand? Imagine if you were a student in the class, how would you feel about the board? So I'm now going to give you an opportunity. I'm now going to give you an opportunity to ask me any questions you have about board work, maybe something which I have not mentioned yet. So I'll have 10 minutes for this session. If you want, write your questions in the chat box and I will answer as many as I can. You're all very welcome. Are there any questions which I can answer? So I see we have a question about how to combine board work and a screen when you are using a PowerPoint. So I have worked in an academy where we had a PowerPoint and the board went around it. I would recommend when you are formatting your PowerPoint to create a white column on the side of it. I'll use the arrow here. So imagine this whiteboard here is a PowerPoint page. I would create a column here in white that you will not use for the PowerPoint. So your PowerPoint will be all of this area, but on one side of the slide, you've got a white column so that you can still include new vocabulary down this column here. And that was something that's very useful for me when I've worked with PowerPoints. In this case, you might not have room to keep your aims for the class, but perhaps if those are on the first slide and on your last slide, so you can remind your students what they've learned in the lesson, that can be a way to remind them of their objectives. But I would definitely recommend keeping a column on the PowerPoint slide for new vocabulary still. How many new words should we teach for students in a lesson? Can we teach more than 10 new words in a lesson? So that refers to your language focus of the class if it's a vocabulary lesson. Normally, you should choose between 6 to 10 new words for a vocabulary lesson that you will teach in the class. What you include in that vocabulary column that I'm signaling here isn't necessarily the language from the lesson, but it could be words which your students are having difficulties with, or maybe when they were brainstorming, it was a useful word, or they're trying to say a word but they don't know it, and you can help them by adding the word here on the side. Oops, my arrows. Okay, where should we write the title of the lesson? If you want to write the title of the lesson on the board, I've created a box. If you want to write the title of the lesson, I would write it here at the top of the board and underline it. And that you would keep on the board. You don't need to wipe that off the board. For example, imagine your title of your class is, going on holiday. You can write that at the top here, and that can stay at the top so students know what that is. All right. What other questions? PowerPoint is half the board, and the rest of the half is for writing. Good. Yeah, that's a good idea. So dividing your PowerPoint, but making sure it's big enough that people can still see it. How to write more than 8 new phrases on the board. So this question here from Kim Ngan. How to write 8 new phrases on the board. If you're writing new sentences on the board, remember to do that when the students are busy reading or having discussion groups, so that they are not watching you write 8 new expressions on the board, which can take time. Should we divide many columns on the board to write for each part we teach? If you divide your board into too many different columns, it can become very distracting for your students. So in terms of writing for each stage of the lesson, this is when we really need to consider what do we need to keep on the board and what can we wipe off the board. We don't want to keep everything we've written in the lesson on the board for the entire class. What other questions? How can I write words and questions practicing on the board? So I would use that. Do you remember when we had the 3 sections with the aims with section number 2? Section number 2 is where I would write questions that you want. And if you want for practice questions, I would include that all here in the middle section. Where can I write the structure and when should I wipe it off? Write the structures here in the middle. If it's something you want to keep on the class, for the class to use in later stages, you can write it at the top or closer to the top so that it stays there. When you wipe off other things below it, at the next stage, you still have the structure at the top here. So that would be very important in your plan to write that you want to keep the structure on the board. So where is the best place for that to be? If there's no PowerPoint, I often divide the board into 4 parts. Is it confusing for the students? I don't think so. If you very clearly say where your things are on the board and your students understand it, separating it into sections is always a good idea. All right. So what I'm now going to do is show you the final question. In order to receive your certificate at the end of the course, you need to answer this question here. So what you need to do is click this link here, and you are going to see this question. When you write new vocabulary on the board, you should include A, a sentence with a word in it, B, the word class and pronunciation features, or C, the translation of the word. Okay, so you need to click this link and choose answers A, B, or C as proof that you have attended this webinar here. So I would like to thank you very much for all attending this webinar on how to improve your board work. I hope it's given you some good tips and some advice which you can use. And I would definitely recommend stepping back and reflecting on your board work for the future. And if you're having problems clicking the link, I'm sure we can include it in the chat. I think I've just read. Um, yes, there we go. Thank you very much, Marina. So she's copied the link, so you can click it and go and answer the question there. Thank you very much for attending this webinar, and good luck with the rest of your course. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.